So, without any further ado, I'm very happy to welcome Sandrine Dixson-Declève, co-president of the Club of Rome.
Thank you so much, Jakob, and I hope that you can share my slides, as we had a bit of an issue with me sharing. Wonderful. I think everyone can see it.
So, do you see the slides, Sandrine?
I see it. Does everyone else see the slides?
Works. Perfect. Yep.
Super. Okay. I think this is a big day for Europe, and Jakob, it's I think you must have had a premonition scheduling this after the State of Union address. I think we really need to take a step back and a deep breath and realize what President von der Leyen has just laid out. There clearly are some issues with some parts of the State of the Union, and she's received some comments in particular with regard to migration policy and our foreign policy with regard to Belarus and other areas, which does have a direct impact on resilience, clearly. But those of us who are working in the area of looking at the convergence of the tipping points between the pandemic, climate change, and clearly biodiversity loss, and many of you have seen the recent report from WWF, I firmly believe that the State of the Union address is leading us in the right direction towards building, first of all, recovering from COVID, and then building the resilient Europe that we need in order to really confront the shocks that we will have, this multiple shock syndrome that we already predicted 50 years ago in the Club of Rome. So what I want to focus on is how do we actually combine emergency action as we are faced with a pandemic, but also look at systemic transformation. Next slide, please. And part of that is looking already, there we go. I took some highlights of the president's speech because I think it's important that we focus on some of the aspects and look at what resilience means. As Jean-Éric knows through the think tank that was started by Jean-Éric himself, ESSIR, so looking at the economic and societal impacts of research and innovation, which I feel very, very honored to chair, we've been clearly indicating both to the Commission in terms of the recovery, but also to the outside world that we must design ourselves out of this mess and not just react to disaster. And that is one of the key areas that obviously the president has focused on. And also make sure that we as Europe focus on leadership and not get caught up in the diktats of others who aren't exactly the enlightened leaders that we would like to see. I think the other key aspect and part of the bouncing forward, which you've talked about, Jakob, is to remember that we can't actually build back everything. And that is a point that we forget. Building back better is not possible because we've lost the glaciers. We've lost our tropical forests. We've lost parts of our natural habitat that we cannot build back. What we can do is reconstruct our economic systems, our finance systems, our ecosystems in order to become more resilient. But we have lost a great deal of our natural capital, which we will not be able to build back. And that means that if we're really going to propel forward, then we're going to have to look at a systems change and look at this incredible wording, which again, I feel that we've been able to work with the president to stimulate. Systemic modernization across our economies, one which is not based on wealth at all costs or GDP growth, as you see in the next bullet point, but one which is foundationally looking at the well-being of Europeans and the rest of the world. And I really commend the European Commission and the leadership of the president in very much thinking about also within the context of the virus, making sure that we're looking at solidarity in our resilience and that we are not just building for ourselves. And that is also a very key point within the message of the State of the Union address. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice? Well, we at the Club of Rome put forward the Planetary Emergency Plan. For us, this was a plan of action which actually would look at resilience. And it's quite dramatic, okay? It's looking at the emergency at hand and the type of actions that we need within a human dimension. So we looked at taxation, Jakob, you've already brought up. How do we actually put in place the taxation frameworks that ensure that we do have a more equitable distribution of wealth, that we prop up a healthy people within, however, a healthy planet. Thus, we need to look at the tensions between the people and planet. And that was the way in which, unfortunately, Macron lost a trick, exactly as you indicate. Not thinking about how we could actually counterbalance labor taxation with product taxation or carbon taxes. And that, I think, is very important. The other key part of the Planetary Emergency Plan is linking the human dimension then to how we actually transition out of high carbon products, processes, and our dependency on high carbon energy. And that within itself needs to be looked at very carefully. So again, where are the tensions? How do we unpack the tensions? And then linking that clearly to our material use, the way in which we want to move towards circularity, regenerative economic systems, and where do we create the corridors between our rural areas and our urban areas, and ensure that we create the resilience that we need between these areas through the types of policies that we've also put in place. Resilience very clearly from a structural perspective, but also from a political perspective as we're looking at populism. Also a very important point. All of these have been fleshed out as actions within our Planetary Emergency Plan. Next slide, please. And I think they've also been fleshed out in some of the work that we're doing with DG Research and Innovation through the economic and societal impacts think tank that I have just indicated to you. So it's here, because what we've tried to do is look very much at unpacking how do we protect people, planet, and prosperity? What type of indicators do you need in place in your economic system in order to ensure that that happens? What type of market mechanisms do you need in order to ensure that that actually happens in practice? And then how do you ensure that you start to put in the short-term systems change, the levers that we need, all the way from as specific as the taxonomy, for example, and how do we use the taxonomy for the moment, which is an investment tool, as a way to place actually green criteria against our funding mechanisms with regard to research and innovation? Or how do we ensure that we put in the right criteria that we see also within the taxonomy to ensure that it's actually within the recovery plan? So how do we already embed in our short-term reaction to the virus resilience principles which are going to enable the long-term transformation in systems that we need? Because at the end of the day, we will need a full-scale transformation over this decade of action. That transformation has to be comparable to the emergency at hand, the fact that actually we have the convergence of these tipping points, and we have to have clear actions to build that resilience. Next slide, please. Oh, I don't know what happened here. This is unfortunately, okay, well, I'll try to, don't look too much at the slide, and I'll try to indicate to you what it actually means. But the key focus here is the fact that we believe that COVID is a moment of reflection in order to actually ensure that we do transform. We need to take the transformations that we've seen within this moment and will continue to be, whether it be the way in which entrepreneurial activity actually transformed itself to be more resilient during the COVID crisis, or whether it be the way in which people reacted to be more resilient. Tap into that consciousness and actually look at how we can replicate some of that transformation, not only in terms of clear examples, but also in terms of how people have reacted. So behavioral change. Because if we talk about resilience, we cannot just get into a technocratic conversation around what this actually means. We must get into how do we actually bring people on the journey? What needs to happen so that people actually shift their behaviors and don't go back to business as usual? What type of communications do we need to put in place? But how can we actually get to the hearts and souls of the people that have just actually suffered a great pandemic and make them realize that the vision of the future can be positive? Next slide, please. Part of that is clearly the European Green Deal. Can you get to the next slide? Wonderful. Okay, so let's get to the specifics of the European Green Deal, and then I'll slowly start to wrap up. I think it's really important that if we look at the European Green Deal also, as the president has indicated, as a transformational tool, a tool for us to actually start to move towards a more socially just and also green economy. Where are the tensions? What we need to do as practitioners, as thought leaders, is understand where the tensions are and already start to work on those tensions. So if we look at farm to fork policy, we know that we need to work with, obviously, the agro industry, but also look at CAP policy reform and what that means for farmers. And then we need to figure out, what does that mean in terms of, again, the disenfranchisement of rural communities? How can we bring rural communities on board? How can we make this a win-win for them? That resilience within land use is both a more resilient rural community in terms of employment, but also resilience in terms of protection of our planetary boundaries. And that is fundamental. If we look at the other side, for example, ensuring that we achieve our climate neutrality, as we've just had a declaration of 2030 greenhouse gas emissions, 55% limit now. We must work with the fossil fuel industry, and we must work with the hard to abate sectors. Again, where is the resilience within our industrial base? How do we look at infrastructure? How can we ensure that we actually preserve industrial communities that are shifting as they transition, in particular in Central and Eastern European countries, but across the board, so that we make these thriving industrial zones rather than just an old part of the economy and not a part of the new economy. And that's fundamental. And we can see these tensions across the board in terms of the way in which we look at circularity, in terms of the way in which we try to bring in different parts of the European community and the different member states into this regional approach, which is incredibly exciting. But if we don't bring people on board, if we don't bring sectors on board and unpack these tensions that I've just described, then we are doomed for failure. Next slide, please. Part of that is telling the right stories. Part of that means that we need to understand which stories fit for when and where. What does that mean for particular regions? The fact that we can clearly talk about jobs growth if we shift into cleaner jobs. We've got these statistics in Germany with regard to renewables versus coal, or that we can actually look at the potential job creation as we move towards organic or regenerative agriculture, or that we look at the potential reduction in unemployment via circular economy. This comes back to your original point of the social being linked to the environmental, right? If we don't want people in the streets and more gilets jaunes, we have to think about both. Next, please. It also means about maximizing our funding and our finance principles to ensure that they go to the right place. We will never have proper resilience across Europe if we don't shift our financial frameworks. And this is just an example of some of the work that we've been doing with the investment community to look at the maximization of the financial frameworks to enhance and optimize where they need to go as we shift into the transition and we apply the European Green Deal. Next slide, please. This is just more of that contribution that's absolutely fundamental. Clearly, we know that we need to cost externalities, but then we need to reflect those externalities within our financial system and our economic system. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to finish with this, that leapfrogging to a resilient Europe is based on a variety of foundational shifts and leap of faith. One is that we do need to have emergency plans in order to emerge from the emergency. And this is part of the message that we've had. We now have 1,700 jurisdictions across the globe, 30 countries who actually have declared an emergency. Declaring an emergency means you then put the actions in place that are necessary. Our emergency plan is a European Green Deal, but it is also the recovery package, which needs to be ambitious and linked to green and social criteria. Action now is absolutely fundamental for resilience later. We cannot talk about a 2050 goal without acting now. It has to be transformational, not incremental. We have to be collaborative, not individual, and creative and co-designing in terms of the way in which we move forward, bringing all stakeholders on board. Obviously not business unusual, sorry, not business as usual, but business unusual, and taking risks. This will be the absolute. We will have to take risks very quickly. One of the conversations that we have with Climate Kick, for example, where I sit on the advisory board and also within the context of the SEER, is we will need to take risks in this very short time period in order to really understand the way in which what works can work in what particular system. And that is about deep demonstrations. That's about really figuring out very quickly what actually we can do, what's our maneuverability, who do we need to bring on board. And then, of course, we absolutely need to think about just transition. We need to think about the most vulnerable within our society, the most vulnerable within the European Union, and work towards a circular and regenerative system which is pragmatic and practical. But also, and I will close with that, we will need to look at pricing. We will need to look at how we cost externalities. We will need to look at measuring and putting in place the right structures to make that work. And so I will close, and Jean-Éric knows that this is one of the ways that I often close, but I think it's fundamental, that our moonshot is not going to the moon. And I've got Tintin, we are in Belgium, many of us. This is Tintin's fusée or missile. And that has to be our moonshot, is the Earth. So going down and preserving what we have rather than always focusing on going up to another planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandrine.